thinking through sort of the financial design and sort of that base level, taking extra time for that, right? How you build your hierarchies, how do you build your chart of accounts, things like that that feel really mundane and like you could do later are actually the ways that you're going to set yourself up to have all the other work streams go more efficiently.
Welcome to Controllers Classified, the podcast where we take a deep dive into the dynamic world of controllers, accountants, and finance leaders, and hear how their ever-evolving roles are redefining accounting and the future of business. And now, here's your host, Erik, Zhou.
Welcome to Controllers Classified. I'm your host, Erik Zhou, Chief Accounting Officer at Brex. Today, I'm honored to welcome Lindsey Oshita, the Americas CAO at Franklin Templeton. Lindsey has spent nearly her entire career working her way up at Franklin Templeton. And as a fun fact, she also used to be one of my main clients when I was at PwC. The audit must have been okay because she's decided to join us on this show. But welcome, Lindsey. Thank you for joining.
Thanks for having me, Erik.
Why don't you just kick off by telling us a little bit about Franklin Templeton, your role there?
So I've been at Franklin for just under 14 years now. I am responsible for external reporting, technical accounting, and also now have responsibility for controls, for SOX, external consolidation, and compensation accounting, as well as business support for the Americas. So that includes Canada, US, and Latin America.
I mean, Franklin Templeton, when I thought about my time serving you guys, huge multinational financial institution, you got operations everywhere. The Americas is obviously a big part of that. Tell me about before getting into Franklin, huge public company. Where were you at before? How did you end up in accounting?
I've never met anybody who, like me, decided that they wanted to be an accountant when they were 16. So a little unusual in that regard. I really liked math in high school, and so decided accounting sounded like a good path for me. And I had an opportunity to work at a really small local accounting firm here in San Francisco when I was 16. So I worked there over the summers in high school through college. They let me continue working there. And it was a great opportunity for me to see what in theory accounting was. I did high net worth taxes, audits for nonprofits, and then the not-for-profit tax returns. So they didn't scare me away. They were wonderful people. And so after college, they actually encouraged me to go interview at the Big Four. And so I ended up working in the Deloitte San Francisco office for 6 years, focused on financial services. My dad was a banker for many years, his 50-year career at Wells Fargo. So I knew I wanted to be in financial services. Tech was not for me, but I did try out a whole slew of industries when I was at Deloitte and really enjoyed my time and knew it was time for the next step. And I joined Franklin, and I guess the rest is a little bit of history.
Yeah. When you were a client, you were in a core technical accounting role, and I believe you led all of global policy for
Correct,
accounting
yeah.
policy for Franklin. That's a big job in my view. Like, I'll tell the audience, like, I kind of looked up to you, to be frank.
Oh, that's
yeah. I mean,
nice
I'm
to
a
hear.
technical accountant at heart. That's probably the most enjoyable parts of my core job at Brex. But now that you're in this CAO role, how have your responsibilities expanded, and how have you kind of adjusted to that role?
It's interesting. So actually in 2019, I took on corporate accounting for the Americas, and there was, some shifting parts. And I actually, for a short period of time, gave up technical accounting. And even through my time when I led that group, I always said, I loved it. It was always interesting, challenging. For me, the global aspect is actually really what continued to challenge and encouraged me to keep at it here at Franklin. Because I got to meet people from all over. I worked with the team in Asia and team in Europe on a variety of things as they came up within the business, right? How does that impact us? How are we thinking about that and achieving some global standardization? And during my time doing technical accounting, I was able to do things like go and meet with the SEC and walk them through, as an industry, what our views were on consolidation. When I was at Deloitte, I would say I did not expect myself to be such a technical accounting kind of nerd at heart. But when I joined Franklin, it was right when FAS 167 came out, and I really enjoyed, and this is going to sound very nerdy, I really enjoyed being able to like read the standard start to finish and see how it came together and the thought process and the logic around it. And when you're in public accounting, you don't really have time or opportunity to do. But adjusting to that and kind of taking what I learned from that and applying it to the sort of controllership role has been good. And I think working with folks and giving, people who maybe came up through really the close process, which I didn't have direct experience in, learning from them, in the day to day, and then also taking what I've learned and help them grow in that way. I think hopefully they will say was beneficial for kind of both sides.
When I and I still run aspects of technical accounting at Brex, and I did a lot of the memo reviews when I was at PwC, the audit firm that I was at. When I was at PwC, I always looked at it from a standards perspective, like GAAP, like make sure it's compliant with GAAP. Does this make sense? Now that I'm on this side of the fence, I've realized the goalposts can be pretty wide and that there can be a lot of diversity in practice. When you were in that technical accounting role, how did you balance that? Like, your guys are a public company too, so you're dealing with investors. What you're reporting goes out to the street. They judge your stock based on that. How did you think about that?
So it was always sort of looking at how we approached it was looking at what the standard setters, like what problem were they trying to solve? What did they feel like needed clarity? And, ultimately also, what do investors look for? What information are they really trying to understand about the company? And I think the approach we've always taken is what is the most useful information for the investor to understand our business and what we do, right? And making sure our disclosures align to that, how we account for things, and also balancing, the letter of the law and the operations of it. So taking exactly what you said, right? What the standard actually says, and then understanding how do we operationalize that and make sure we are in compliance, that we're always thinking about kind of what that rule is and how do we build a process around that.
Now that you're in your role, it's shifted to like now that you have to operationalize it too now, right?
Correct. It was a little easier when I was in policy and I didn't have the teams who actually had to do the work of it. And so I think, I have a new perspective, I would say, on, what things, materiality, when you're in audit, you think about that and it's not just, okay, well, individually, but how do we get comfortable? What are the things that keep me up at night? What are the things that keep my bosses up at night? But yeah, making sure ultimately that we go back to the heart of it and that we are compliant. And obviously now I have SOX, so also thinking about really from a risk perspective, where are our riskiest areas and making sure we're putting the resources in the right place and the sort of brain power to those areas.
For the audience, Franklin Templeton is a September 30th year end. So your year end is coming up, 10K time.
Yeah.
What's on your roadmap leading into year end and potentially even going into next year if you've already thought about that kind of planning?
We do. And I think especially over the last few years, we have acquired quite a number of companies. And, I think every year what we try to do is look at what we disclose and taking a fresh look at how we describe things, what we're saying out in, with the SEC and out in the public and making sure we take a fresh look at that, right? So just because we've always described something a certain way, we definitely look at that every year as we lead up to the 10K process. And we work really closely with, our investor relations teams and make sure that all the documents that are moving together during sort of the preparation phase, and Erik, I know you probably deal with this, that they all sort of jive together and that it's really telling a cohesive story and describing what's happening in the business appropriately. And then, planning for the future, we recently announced that we entered into an agreement to purchase Putnam Investments. And so, that will be a big one for us for next year. And I think that will take up a good chunk of our time. And again, every time we approach an acquisition, each one is unique and different. But making sure we approach it and look at the strengths of the teams coming together. When we did the Legg Mason deal back in 2020, I think I have truly benefited from my colleagues that came over from that group. They have a different perspective. Obviously, everyone has their own experience. And I think we're a stronger organization for kind of having that collaboration of thought come together.
And tell me a little bit about, so you're going to buy Putnam, or you've already entered into a definitive agreement to buy Putnam. You had a huge transaction a few years ago with Legg Mason, right? You acquired Legg Mason. Tell me about that integration with that team, because I think they're based out of Baltimore, right? And you guys are kind of West Coast based in San Francisco. So
Yes.
tell me about that. I think it was during the pandemic too. That must have been difficult trying to organize it all. And what lessons are you going to take from that into Putnam going into this upcoming year?
So they are based in the East Coast, and I tell folks my days start a little earlier. Their days go a little longer. Everyone just kind of adjusts to working on both coasts. We announced that deal right before really pandemic, all the lockdowns. So it was interesting. Normally during an acquisition, especially of that size, you would have people getting together, sitting in a room, hashing things out, spending a few days together. We didn't have that benefit, but we all got really used to, Teams and being on video. My teams prior to that all my direct reports were outside of San Mateo. So I had sort of already gotten used to that, but working from home, I actually think we achieved a ton because of the pandemic. Folks weren't going out, they weren't, vacationing. They did take some vacations, but, people just kind of sat down and got through it. But, we really, especially within finance, I think we merged the two teams. So it wasn't our way or their way. The message from management, which I think was well received and really needed, was you take sort of view A and view B and maybe come up with view C as you two, as the two groups talk together. And I think we've been really successful in that and sort of merging. The cultures were fairly similar, so that was helpful. But we had sort of also taken an opportunity to relook at how we had organized finance, and so we also redesigned, and so we now have sort of centers of excellence, folks who specialize in certain areas like leases or revenue recognition. Which I think give different opportunities to folks than sort of your typical corporate accounting structure.
What was it like before in terms of looking at those kinds of areas versus where you're at now after the Legg merger?
So we historically had been really kind of entity focused, and so there were folks who focused on broker dealers. I know that's what when your time with us, Erik. So we still have specialists in certain areas, broker dealers, et cetera. But then like leases, for example, or revenue recognition, when I was sitting in the policy side, it was training and educating a whole slew of folks from around the world on what it means, what our policy it was and is, and how they should implement that. And now we have sort of a central revenue team who we work with. My policy team works with closely on those technical issues, but it is very focused. And so you get a different perspective, right? They then look at it across the globe, across multiple gaps, and so they get the opportunity, all of folks in each individual team, to really dig in, understand, and build up some of their technical knowledge in that regard.
Do you think you'll lose out on some of the, because sometimes some of these statutory audits and statutory financials, they're giving a holistic view of just that entity, and you don't need to bring in everything from around the globe. Do you still have those folks that look after those entities and are responsible for the holistic view of that particular business?
We do. So that is really kind of, part of my team overseeing business support and the CAO office, if you will, for the Americas. It's business support, it's regulatory and statutory financials, and my counterparts in Asia and Europe do the same. So they are heavily involved with the business, can then take the books and records, build the financials, tell that story similarly to the board or to the regulators in those jurisdictions. So I think we've been able to kind of manage the best of both sides. You get that specialty, and then have folks who are more connected with the business. And then the other piece to that is actually then we have an opportunity for folks to rotate through. So the teams, and we have quite a large team in Hyderabad out in India, that they get an opportunity to see those different things and build their career, not just linearly, but they can move to different teams, learn something new, and grow in that way and continue to build their career.
So speaking of Hyderabad, actually, I think that's an interesting segue. I have outsourced personnel also. I use Genpact. We have a team of about 7 folks. They do a lot of our daily cash reconciliations, AP processing, work that I think, it's bookkeeper level work. We have those folks do it. We decided to outsource that because it was easier on us because it's only 7 folks. I guess like for you, how do you think about for Franklin, and now you're monitoring
Right.
kind of like this operational team in India, bringing it in-house, and maybe that decision was made a while ago, but like, do you see the benefits of that? Is there any thought of like taking it outsourced again? Like, how do you think about that?
No, so we definitely made a decision early to invest in India. We also have a group in Poland, and to build that team. I think we have seen the benefit of having that. We're such a large organization, that it is significantly larger than a 7-person team. And I think for us, it's been great to see some of the folks that we hired when we first, opened the campus, really move up through the ranks, become leaders in their respective area. And so for us, we see the benefit. We invested in those folks, and really see them as part of the future leadership team here at Franklin. So the question does come up. We definitely believe they are part of the team. They're part of sort of the Franklin family, and have seen definite benefits out of that.
All right, going back to the merger, there's the before and then there's the after. So after the merger, now that you're actually officially reporting as a combined unit, what changed about your like what were the most difficult parts of making sure things continue to run smoothly post merger, or did you kind of still run 2 different ships and then we're still working on it?
So we closed the deal 2 months before our year end. So I would say that first year end it was our first year end during the pandemic, so everyone was working from home. It was a little more stress. There was more stress in the system, I would say. We did maintain their system, and that has really then we took the opportunity to integrate that over time and to be thoughtful about that. Sort of concurrently, we also had looked at our financial system and decided to also make a change. So there were a lot of things in flight. And so we took the opportunity to say, what's the best path and how do we get there together? And
You did
so
a whole
there
ERP
was,
change during that time.
correct. Yeah. It was after, but it was sort of in flight, at that time.
And then Leg was also on a different ERP?
Correct.
Wow. So you had
Yeah.
migrations for 2 different ERP systems into a new one, basically, because of the merger.
Correct. Yeah. Yeah.
I guess I don't know how to think. How, I mean, there's a little bit of also the data would have had to come. I mean, I don't know how historicals would have worked, but like that must have been a huge IT commitment. Like I'm just thinking through the manpower it
It
would
was.
take. Yeah.
It was, and I think we implemented. So we're now on Workday, and we implemented that at the start of this fiscal year. But obviously that was a huge lift over the last year and a half. And there's still pieces that are coming together as we've moved. Leg was actually on Workday, but a different instance. So there were learning things for us not being on Workday, having that come up. But again, I think taking the opportunity to look at both processes, how they did it, knowing what they knew and had learned. What did we do? And we were previously on PeopleSoft. How we thought we should build it. And it was sort of this is how we did it. This is how they did it in the old system. If we had a clean sheet of paper and knowing what we know now, what would we do? And there continues, I would say, to be learnings over that. And with any ERP implementation, things change, and as you settle into the system, there are aspects to that you continually refine. And I think that's also been a really big part of the culture of the sort of combined organization is, how do we make things more efficient? How do we think about things differently and work differently to be smarter with our resources and thoughtful in that way.
And how long were you guys on PeopleSoft before?
I want to say 20 years.
Okay. Yeah, so I kind of like, I'm hearing this story and I'm thinking that's actually a great sequence of events. Because I
Yes.
feel like if you didn't have the Workday implementation already lined up, now you're bringing in whatever leg was doing onto PeopleSoft, or maybe you move your stuff onto their instance of Workday, however you want to design it. But now that you're combining two big companies, like given that you were already implementing Workday, you're giving yourself a green field. Like you can almost reimagine, like to your point, right? All these processes that you may have had for 20 years, right? Because someone made a decision on how to do fixed assets 20 years ago in PeopleSoft, and people just roll it forward year after year.
Correct.
Now, with the new implementation and with the merger, it sounds like a whole lot of work, but it feels like the ROI setting yourselves up for the next 20 years is immense.
Yeah. And so, we kicked off, I want to say, quickly in 2021, the full Workday kind of project. And we were really ambitious in what we thought the timeline was to implement, and looked at all the risks and decided start of the fiscal for 2023 was the best timing. But yeah, it was sort of full speed ahead, really.
Any tips for like what to look out for in such a big project?
I would say thinking through sort of the financial design and sort of that base level, taking extra time for that, right? How you build your hierarchies, how do you build your chart of accounts, things like that feel really mundane and like you could do later, are actually the ways that you're going to set yourself up to have all the other work streams go more efficiently if you're really thoughtful in that aspect of it. So we had a whole team dedicated to that. I think that would be as you implement, once you decide, what system you're going to use, that is really the key that unlocks so much.
For our listeners, can you just, what's so important about the chart of accounts? Like what do you mean by, isn't it just a set of numbers? You start with one, you go to 1 million. Like what's the big deal? Like what are you talking about?
And Erik, I don't recall if this happened when you were there, but we actually, over the years, when you have a chart of accounts, people add to it, and it might be used initially for one thing, very specific. It could be regional specific. That then gets morphed over time, and then people don't really remember what it was initially set up for. So years ago, and this was even before we even had an inkling of Workday or changing, we had gone through, and it was an idea that came from one of the supervisors and managers in our team in Canada. She had the idea, we really need to go through and revamp this, right? Look at how we're using it globally. And so we set up a committee, and it was a 2-year project to really solicit feedback from every region. How are people using the accounts? Making sure we were comfortable where that landed in our ledger, and also thinking through how the process worked, and do we need a expense and liability 1-for-1 mapping, or should we be pulling those to, aggregating that and have a true reconciliation? So questions that, and I think it was good. I was sitting in policy at the time, because you're removed from the day-to-day operations, so you can challenge people to think about it differently. And sometimes it was, well, this is how PeopleSoft works, this is how the system works, you have to do it this way. And so taking all of that learning that we did, and a lot of the revamping and cleanup, and then taking it that step further, understanding how the system works, and we went with Workday, how that works and how we can make it work for what we want in a way that gives us data more readily to how we would analyze it, how we would talk to our CFO, how we would talk to the street about that. How do we slice and dice it? And making sure the operations then balanced with that. And then even small things like you run out of numbers. So yes, you start with 1 and go down, but if you only have 10, that's a very small window of things.
And I think what you're saying is like, and this is how I did my chart of accounts. Like my first digit, I call it the major class. So if it's a 1, 2, 3, or 4, it denotes if it's an asset, a liability, equity account, etc. The second 2 digits may denote the subsidiary it's related to. The fourth digit may be location. Each number in a 10-digit string or what have you denotes something about what the account is attributable to. So I think,
and then it helps, folks as they get used to those new numberings. It's like, oh, okay, it's in the 1,000. Okay, I know that's an asset. I know that's cash. And kind of the same for companies, because we are such a global organization. How many numbers do you really need? Do you have more than 100 entities in a given region? So kind of similar. We do, first digit is the Americas, which then included, Latin America, Canada, and organized it that way. And then for us, we have to consolidate quite a number of our products, just as a result of some seed that we put in. So where do we put that in the numbering scheme? How does that get organized? So little things like that help, from my perspective at least, as we structured it, so that way we could group things how we think about them as an organization, and giving us enough space to continue growing. So then you don't have that, you only have 3 digits, and once you're past the 100s, you then have to go to an 800s, and so then your regions are in a couple different places.
I want to go back to a comment you had about having one expense account for every liability account, or vice versa. And I went through this when I was designing the chart of accounts at Brex.
Yeah.
And we had one for everything. I wanted to do like one account, like we have different advertising and marketing expense accounts, right? So we have one for sales and promotional giveaways, one for outdoor ads, one for something else, blah, blah, blah.
Right.
And then I had an AP account for each one. And then I was like, oh, let's have also an accrued liability account for each one. And I think I kind of look back at it, and we now have consolidated, but it like very quickly it felt overboard, because it's just too much. It's too much for like my folks in India that are doing all the AP invoicing. It's too much. You know what I mean? Yeah. So did you guys get to the same conclusion? I'm curious.
I think part of it is because I sat in the technical side. To me, it was, well, when I look at it, at the ledger, when I get a report, well, to me, it made sense that we would have, okay, marketing, here's all of our marketing accrual all in one place, to use your example. And I think the operations team, really the accountants, it was a shift in how they thought. I think now, especially with Workday, there's some other capabilities and categories that we can use. And so we've definitely leveraged that. And so it's, okay, what's the right level? Your account level, that's that aggregate number, but you have sort of, for us, spend categories. So you can break it down if someone were to need that level of detail. But when we send a report to a CA, our corporate CAO, she doesn't need necessarily all that level of detail, and so it's aggregated at the right level.
Makes sense.
So we moved away. We definitely, and probably I was one of the folks who pushed and challenged folks to aggregate and think about what really needs to be account versus sort of that sub-ledger detail.
So one thing that we haven't touched upon, and I'm just curious about it, you spent, a number of years at Deloitte, made your way to Franklin, worked your way up. I mean, I think I still look up to you. It's pretty cool,
Oh,
your job. Yeah. Tell me about during that whole journey, was there any role of mentorship or sponsorship for you? Have you done that for others? Did you receive that? I'm assuming so. I mean, that's what got me to where I am in some
mhm.
ways. But how does that work at Franklin?
So, we have, I would say, a number of different avenues for that. So at Deloitte, definitely. And I think public accounting is really good at structuring that. You have a counselor, you get assigned certain people who officially are your, sort of advocates. And over time that may change and you obviously develop relationships. For me, I've always taken the approach, and probably because I worked in a small office, that, you know, I have found sort of mentors, if you will, in different aspects, right? So to me, it doesn't always have to be somebody that's higher in the organization. You can learn from anybody, right? So it could be that I look to an accountant level person because they have this experience and that knowledge, and so hey, I need to grow in that area, so how do I connect with those folks? But I definitely have had great sponsors and mentors in my career at Franklin. My former boss, my current boss, they are, I'm open with them. I have those conversations about what I want out of my career, where I want to go, things that are interesting. I've been lucky that they've offered me things that continue to challenge me and grow. So it's not like I've needed to really seek that out. And then, Franklin also has various programs that they, have us as participate in, strategic leaders, where you officially ask somebody to be a sponsor, if you will. And for me, I, reached out to somebody from Lake Mason, so somebody who I didn't have quite that same, experience and history with. And to learn from them, right, and get that different perspective. So I think I've been really lucky in that it's happened. And then sort of outside of work, um, my dad actually had worked in internal audit at Wells Fargo for quite a number of years, and one of his he always describes him as his best boss. He ended up moving up the ranks. He actually had also come from, I believe, Deloitte. But he has always been a great mentor for me. When things have come up, if I need to bounce something off of him, he's always been willing to talk to me. And he moved into a number of different operations and moved around in his career. And I think the best advice he gave me as I was thinking about things, as I was thinking about leaving Deloitte, was find things that it doesn't necessarily have to be a change in role or a change in title, but it has to be something that you are continuing to grow and add a new tool to your tool belt or toolbox, right? And for me, for whatever reason, that really stuck, because it's easy to say, oh, I think I'm going to go to that company. I want to do X, Y, or Z. And he would always challenge me, as I was thinking about things, between Deloitte and here. Well, is that going to give you a different experience? Is that going to continue your path to grow? And will you add anything? Or are you just redoing what you've already done? And for me, it was a great perspective. And I've kind of continued to think about that through my career.
Yeah, I think, and you've probably seen the articles, the accounting profession isn't getting as many new entrants as it once
Mm-hmm.
was every year. Maybe they're all becoming software engineers. Um, I think the community aspect of our profession is extremely important. The mentorship that we can provide to others, the mentorship, frankly, that I'm still receiving from many others, it's one of the highlights of the work. I think, it's one of those jobs where, in theory, to your point, the more you
Mm-hmm.
work, you age like a fine wine. Like the more experience you get, the more tools you get. Like it's one of those kinds of professions. So that's great. I love hearing kind of like that whole story about your own mentorship and sponsorship and opportunities you've been given. Maybe to close out, I have just one more question.
Okay.
We end each of these podcasts with something fun. So, do you have an accounting joke to share with our audience?
I actually have two. And so one you'll probably appreciate from your time in public accounting, and it's why did the accountant cross the road?
No idea.
Because they looked in the files and did what they did last year.
Oh, it's so good.
So, and then the other one, so an accountant is having a hard time sleeping, goes to see their doctor, says, Doc, I just can't get to sleep at night. And the doctor says, well, have you tried counting sheep? And the accountant replies, well, that's the problem. At some point I make a mistake and then I spend 3 hours trying to figure out what went wrong. Which that one I was like, oh yeah, we've all been there, right? It's
Oh,
the one
Lord.
thing.
You know, for the non-accountant listeners, if we have any on this show, so long. We might never hear from you again.
They're like, oh yeah, that's too
No,
much.
it's good.
No.
It's good. It really touches me. No, that's good. Lindsey, thank you very much for joining us on Controllers Classified. Honored that you joined us today, and just thank you. Yeah, great.
No, thank you, Erik. I appreciate it.
Thanks for tuning in to Controllers Classified, presented by Brex. Brex is an AI-powered spend platform with global corporate cards, expense management, reimbursements, and travel. Visit Brex.com and follow Brex on social to see how they can take your accounting game and your company to new heights.